Metal Jesus here, and I am back with a supersized edition of questions that I'm going to answer here. Specifically, these came from my Patreon contributors, and I want to thank you guys very much for supporting me. But like I said, this is a supersized one, so instead of just doing one question, this week we're going to answer 4 of them, and all of them are pretty interesting. I think you guys are going to like this. So, the first question, Chris asks, what is the most bomb-proof / best built quality console you've owned? Great question. I thought about this for quite a while, and the first console that comes to mind out of my 40 plus consoles here is the Super Nintendo. I've owned, I think, probably 3 of them, and they all work, and they've always worked, and I really haven't heard of them failing very often. I mean, I personally never heard of that. I'm sure it does happen. It's a piece of hardware, but in general, Nintendo made a bulletproof console, and maybe that might be because the original Nintendo, the NES, had some problems, right? And so they obviously seem to have fixed that with the Super Nintendo. But then also I was thinking about Nintendo in general, and the N64 has always been pretty bulletproof in my collection. But more specifically, their handhelds. The Game Boy, the original Game Boy, was pretty bulletproof. Also, the Game Boy Advance. Those, especially the SP, the one that closed in on itself and protected its screen, seems to last forever. I mean, that thing is amazing. All of them that I have work. Even the ones that I bought at garage sales that look like they've been stepped on and maybe driven over by a car, they seem to work. Outside of that, though, the original Atari was really well built. And I remember as a kid, me and my cousin would try to glitch cartridges. So by that you would flick like the power switch or some of the switches on the console to purposely try to glitch out games, and everything always worked. The cartridges always seemed to work. The console always worked. The joystick was built like a tank. And I think the reason for that is because those consoles are relatively simple. There's not a lot of moving parts, where if you get into things like the PlayStation 2 or the Saturn or the Dreamcast or whatever, when you start introducing drives, you have a lot of moving parts. And so there's a lot of potential to fail there. Plus also a lot of consoles, as you move through the 1990s and 2000s, the graphics chips start getting really hot. The processors start getting very warm. And so you start dealing with heat. And again, older consoles just didn't deal with that quite as much. Next question comes from Lauren. She asks, do you prefer fun, family-friendly games like Nintendo's approach, or perhaps high-definition, immersive stories like Sony's approach, and why? Man, I've never really thought of it that way, to be honest. I play games on so many different systems from so many different eras that honestly, it just does not even factor into what I'm looking for. Obviously, those are 2 very different styles, especially when you get, if I start comparing, like, say, modern games that have 3D graphics that are going for more realism compared to something like 2D graphics for the Super Nintendo or, that era. In general, I really just look for games that are fun, and that can really be anything. That's kind of what I go for. I don't necessarily really care, although, in my mind, I'm thinking I do really like games and their technology, and so I'm always drawn to games like, for instance, Uncharted 4, which is gameplay that is not necessarily really revolutionary as far as like the gameplay, right? Like the 3D cover-based shooting, the platforming, that's all been done before, within the last 10 years or so. And yet I was really sucked into the graphics. The graphics were the next step for me. I found myself looking around those levels, and I do really like that. And so it's hard for me to say what I prefer. I guess the one answer to this is that Nintendo's approach is a little bit more timeless, and I say that because you can go back and play some of those 90s era Mario games And even though the polygon counts are fairly low, but the gameplay is pretty solid and it looks like Mario. And so you don't necessarily get that, I don't get that feeling of like, oh, this game is so old, unless the controls are bad. So I hope that answers your question. This next question comes from Ricci. If you had to battle the devil for your soul using any video game from history, which one would you choose and why? I love this question. I actually thought about this question probably more than any other because I thought it was so funny. And the reason why is because growing up, I loved the movie Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure and also the sequel, Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. Now, the reason why I'm laughing is because in Bogus Journey, Bill and Ted die. And they're not smart guys, and they meet up with Death, and Death basically challenges them, I believe, to get their soul back. It's been a while. And he's like, you can play any game you want, choose the game, and we'll battle. Now, I love this because Bill and Ted are not smart guys, and it's pretty obvious that Death would probably win, and he might even cheat. And Bill and Ted choose some hilarious games for this. They choose Twister, that game where you get down on all fours and you have to spin and you have to kind of put your hand and feet in certain places. They play him Battleship. They play him Clue. All these board games and stuff like that kind of put him on even footing, so to speak. And I just thought that was so funny. And so honestly, if I was to take this question serious, the obvious answer is I would probably choose something I was good at. But the thing is, the devil would probably cheat. And any game I'm good at, there's probably somebody who is actually better at it than me. So to actually, so you can see I thought about this. So I was like, okay, I'd have to choose stuff that I know he probably wouldn't cheat. And it's a video game, so you could technically alter the programming. I can nerd out on this way too much. But I was thinking, okay, what would I choose? Now, the ultimate thing I would choose probably is the 4-player Pac-Man arcade game, because in that you have 4 players and they are battling each other and it's really well balanced and you could see if he's probably cheating. And I would bring in someone like Kinsey and Reggie, to kind of be my wingman and hopefully take on Death. That's a good answer there. Then I would probably choose, something dumb like Angry Birds, where it's based on physics. And he and I would play Angry Birds. And again, you played Angry Birds. I'm sure everyone has, where you might do the exact same thing one time and it just doesn't quite, like for whatever reason, the physics are, it'll topple down in weird ways. So maybe that would be a way that would be fair. I'm trying to think of other games like that. Maybe play a game of Pong, something like that, where, of course, it'd probably go back and forth for freaking ever because Pong's so simple. But something like that. I don't know. Great question. I'd love to know in the comments what you would pick. All right, and the last question comes from Joshua. Given the current state of the retro video game collecting scene and the prices that have gone up accordingly without an end in sight, do you see the whole thing crashing at some point, or will it continue to grow for years? The days of $1 games is behind us now. Great question. First of all, I don't think the days of $1 games are behind us, because you have 40 plus years of games to choose from. And I can point at many different systems and say, yes, you can get $1 games for that. The Atari 2600, the Intellivision, the ColecoVision, things like that. Things that aren't necessarily really well sought after, or maybe collectors like me, we have all of the Atari games we want. And so the market has definitely shifted and gone down. I'm trying to think of other systems. I'm looking at the original Xbox. You can definitely find $5 games on the original Xbox. PlayStation 2. Many of the PlayStation 2 games that are out there, you can get for $1. Game Boy Advance, there are some games out there. And what we're really talking about here is the free market, right? It is supply and demand at its purest. When you have a lot of people looking for something, whether it is cars, music, video games, whatever, the prices will tend to go up. And when they're not, they tend to go down. Here's what I think though. So I've given this some thought. You know, right now it seems like we have a lot of collectors out there who are in their late 20s to early 30s, maybe pushing 40, who are going back and buying up their youth, right? They have families, they have decent jobs, the economy's doing okay in most places, and so they are buying up the games they either had as a kid or they've always wanted. And that is what we're seeing here. The other thing too is that there are a lot of gamers out there who don't want big collections like mine, but they do want the games that they used to have as a kid, or maybe they want the games they always wanted. And so for them, spending $60 or $100 or $200 on one game when they'll only have 5 in their collection isn't a big deal. It's a big deal to us because we tend to buy a lot, right? But if you are really just trying to get those 5 NES games that you always wanted and you're going to spend $200 to do it, that's kind of reasonable, right? Or maybe $300, depends on what you want. But you see what I'm getting at here. So those people are driving up those prices. What I do believe though is that NES, Super NES, Genesis games will probably taper off at some point. They have to, because us collectors will reach that point where we either have them or we don't, and we move on. What I do think will probably happen though is that you have the kids that are in their early 20s right now who had the PlayStation 1 and the N64 as their very first console. And when they approach their 30s and they have good jobs and they're stabilized and they maybe have a home and maybe they're, you know, building their first game room, I think they're going to go back and they're going to start buying up the PS1 games. And what I think is going to be pretty interesting is when they start buying the PlayStation 2 games. I'm talking about 5 years, maybe 10 years from now. These PS2 games that you can find fairly easily today, in 10 years, I think you're going to see those prices high. Because again, just like we did, they're going to reach that age where they're going to, there's, you know, it's been like a couple decades since they played a PlayStation 2 game. They're like, man, I'd love to own that again. And they can, right? And you'll start to see those prices rise. I think that'll happen with a lot of systems. The PSP is a great example. A lot of people aren't playing PSP today, or collecting for it, I should say. But we are starting to see that rise for the first time. I think because you have some gamers out there who are a little bit nostalgic for it. Now, it's easy to find them today and they're relatively cheap, but in 10 years, when they're not making them anymore, I think you're gonna see the same thing. I see this with vinyl records. I grew up with vinyl records. Back in the 80s, they were around $10, brand new. And then through the 90s, they had a little bit of a resurgence. And then at the end of the 90s and through most of the 2000s, you could not give away vinyl records. You would go to every garage sale and there was records there for 50 cents, 25 cents, I'll pay you to take them. Yeah, I would go to stores in the Seattle area where vinyl records were, you never paid more than $5 or $10. If you paid $10 for a used record at a store, it was like a rare Beatles album, you know? But today, you pay $20 to $30 for sometimes used records or more. I was just at a store the other day and some of the original Led Zeppelin albums were $75. Now, they made millions of those, and that's crazy to me. But my point is, though, is that it's not just the video game market, it's a lot of things like that. Exotic sports cars is a great example. You used to be able to buy a Lamborghini Countach for about $50,000. That was not unheard of. I remember seeing a Lamborghini Countach on Craigslist here in Seattle. This was like 10 years ago, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, I don't have $50,000. But I remember thinking, it's like, wow, that's like attainable. You know, I could own a Lamborghini for that much. Those days are over, right? And so it's very cyclical. And I don't know, I hope that answers your question. It's obviously complicated. I know a lot of retro stores, like the ones that Kinsey works at, or that you worked at, and also Kelsey currently works at. They thought this bubble would have already crashed, and it hasn't, and it's really surprised them. So who knows? But anyways, guys, that is 4 questions from my Patreon contributors. You guys are awesome for supporting me, and I appreciate you asking these questions and helping me create this content. All right, thanks for watching.